Okay, welcome all to this. Welcome everybody. Just starting in Dutch. Welcome everybody to this meeting of organized by Pickering Global, which is a organization that cooperates between the Grendstad Institute here in Bergen and University of Bergen with the goal of disseminating information to the public. Given that you're all here and also, I guess, many people on Zoom, I think that this goal is obtained. And also welcome to everybody on Zoom. Today we're going to talk about the midterm elections in the US and how it's organized electorally, and especially a focus on gerrymandering. I'm Alexander Verdoes. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Bergen as part of comparative politics, and I look at regional elections in Europe and how regional elections helps and electoral systems. Luckily, I don't know quite a bit about regional elections and electoral systems, but not so much as the US. But luckily, we're joined by two experts on the US. On the left-hand side, I have Gunnar Grendstad, and right-hand side, Hilmar Mjelde. Could you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm a research professor at NORCE, specialized in parties, institutions, and American politics and government, and increasingly getting into French politics too. So it's getting to be almost too much.
Thanks. Peter?
Thank you. I'm a professor at the Department of Comparative Politics. I've done some American politics over the years. More recently, I've been specializing in judicial behavior.
Thank you. So then we can just begin. And first, I would like to talk about structure. So first, we're going to talk about the midterm elections. What are these? Then we zoom into the topic of gerrymandering and electoral engineering. At the end, we open up the floor for questions from you and people on Zoom. So to begin with the first questions, like the midterm elections are coming up later this year. And they're set to elect the House of Representatives, the Senate, and many local offices. Could one of you please explain what the midterm elections are about and what their purpose actually is?
Well, basically, midterms elections are a catchphrase for all types of elections in years other than presidential election years. Because the United States is defined basically by its primary election, which is the presidential election, and all other elections that kind of takes place at different years would be midterm elections. Most conventionally, it would be the even number year presidential elections, where we have the election to all the seats in the House of Representatives and roughly 1/3 of the seats in the US Senate. And then we have basically all elections to state assemblies and also many state governorships. We also have elections in odd number years between those midterm elections again, but those will be at the state level. So that's basically the framework. We talk about midterm elections because we have national elections and we don't have a presidential election.
Want to add something? Or?
I think that sums it up. Yeah, you said all the 435 representatives in the House of Representatives are up for re-election. They serve 2-year terms, all of them. So that's like the popular chamber, if you will. And then the Senate is, yeah, as you said, 1/3. So that means 33 senators, 34 maybe. So they serve staggered terms, so only 1/3 of the Senate up for re-election every 2 years, and each senator serves 6-year terms. So the 1/3 of the senators who are up for re-election this year were initially elected to Congress, to the Senate in 2016. Yeah.
Can I just add something? Because in order for the overall framework here, so the Constitution defines elections to Congress and to the President, and it directs our attention to those elections. But there are so many elections that are organized at the state level and are also administered at the state level. And also the elections to the Senate and to the House of Representatives are organized by the states. And here we have a tension we might return to in a little while, because there's some kind of, the 2 layers that we are addressing. And again, since we have a presidential system in the United States, when there's not a presidential election, there's much more openness, too many different dynamics taking place. That's what makes the midterm election more exciting in a sense than the regular presidential elections.
So it's really a complex system. The United States is a continental nation with 50 states. So there are 50 state elections taking place, or elections for the Congress happening in the states. And I think all 50 state legislatures up for election? Not all governors, but I think all state legislatures.
I think so, yes.
But not all governors. For example, in Virginia, the governor was elected last year. So, but generally, it's all the state legislatures and the elections for Congress that are, as you say, organized by the states. So there's always an election in the United States, and people are always preparing for the next election. And there are even elections for the people who administer the elections. So you have all these popularly elected offices that we don't, there are not elected offices in our system. So that contributes to just the overall level of conflict and tension in the system, that there's always people looking ahead to the next election.
Okay, thanks. You already mentioned that it's the midterm of the presidential elections, and it's not actually presidential office, which is a stake, but there are stakes in these elections for Joe Biden. Can you maybe explain what these are? So
what was basically in a different approach, basically what's taking place is that Biden is in a sense up for reassessment. Because all politicians who have some kind of national ambition, and that's pretty many, they will see how the outcome of this election, what that means for the presidential election in 2024. Because if the House and the Senate go to the Republicans, that will give them a different base for the presidential election in 2 years. And Biden is praying every night that he can, and the Democrats can hold Congress, so he can still try to implement his agenda. Because if he and the Democrats lose this election, both the House and the Senate, which, spoiler alert, which is very likely, then we have introduction of what we refer to as a divided government. And if we look at the pattern historically, the divided government comes in on midterm elections. It reflects the fact that the presidential election has a very strong pull to the presidential party, and that the presidential party will also take charge of the two chambers, Senate and the House. But in absence of a presidential election, a presidential pull, we have, as I said, different dynamics going on. So Biden prays every night that the Democrats will hold Congress, but most likely he will not.
Not to get too much into the politics of it yet, but just do some more level setting. Right now, the Democrats have a 5-seat majority, in the House of Representatives. And the Senate is split 50-50 with 50 Republicans, 48 Democrats, and 2 independents who caucus, who basically have joined, if you will, the Democratic Party. And we say they caucus with the Democratic Party. So basically the Senate is split in two, 50 or 48 Democrats, 2 independents, and then on the other side, 50 Republicans, which means that per the Constitution, the Vice President, Kamala Harris, gets to vote or a decisive ballot to do the what do you call it, the tie breaking. And that happens a lot because there's a lot of 50-50 votes now. So Democrats, in a sense, have a technical majority because they can just bring in Kamala Harris to break the tie. So the Senate is basically split, and the Democrats have a very small majority in the House of Representatives. And spoiler alert, they will lose that majority in the House, and likely also in the Senate.
Can you maybe explain also what the consequences are of having divided governments?
Yeah, it's just basically presidents. American politics is structured around the presidency. That's the way it's been since Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s. He kind of dominates the political system. And presidents don't get a whole lot done unless they have large majorities behind them in Congress, or there is some kind of crisis, some kind of exceptional situation in which the country rallies behind the president. Now, that kind of exceptional situation would be, for example, if the first couple of months after 9/11 or after the Kennedy assassination. So that's really like an exceptional state or case. So normally presidents only get a lot done or get stuff done at all if they have huge majorities behind them in Congress, which presidents usually don't anymore, at least not for more than the first 2 years of their terms. So that leads to gridlock, meaning nothing really gets done, which in turn means that the president has to rely on their executive authority, which is their ability to issue orders to the huge national bureaucracy. That's how they govern today. Presidents issue these executive orders because with gridlock, with narrow majorities in Congress, or even divided government, there's just not gonna be anything that gets done because the opposition party doesn't have any incentive to work with the president because they're always looking ahead to the next election.
So what Hilmar just described now is how the American system was designed to work, to break things up and to slow things down. So if we're frustrated that things are not being done to an extent, that was the intention.
Yeah.
So what we're seeing now is the intention of the founding fathers and the Constitution. This is how it's supposed to be. Just, I think Hilmar was a bit too generous in terms of the hopes of the president for his agenda. That only lasts at maximum 6 months.
Yeah,
You added 18 months, which is kind of technically correct.
Yeah.
But his political capital runs out of steam after 6 months. So now he's just trying to get by, and it's going to get worse after November of this year.
Yeah, I'd say maybe up to a year.
You're still generous.
Yeah. Well, it really happens or depends on I guess what you're trying to do.
Yeah.
Generally, yeah, 6 months to 1 year. And Joe Biden's presidency basically ended. I'd say it ended when that whole Afghanistan fiasco happened, because then he just lost all his momentum. He had one major policy reform after the Afghanistan fiasco, which was the infrastructure bill that passed in November. But that was basically the end of the Biden presidency in terms of getting stuff done. Because now the Republicans they know they're going to win the House election. And so they have no incentive to work with Joe Biden at all. But maybe we're getting a little far ahead here. Maybe we should do more of the congressional stuff.
Yeah, but just going to add there that what happens, as you say, after 6+ months is that the rationale for politicians is to be re-elected. That's the only thing that counts. And if the chances of being re-elected relies on the popularity of Biden, they will turn their backs to Biden and recalculate the re-elections for the midterm in the next 18 months. And that's why we're here.
They basically spend their second year in office, the representatives spend their second year in office campaigning all throughout the year. Even, I mean, they campaign every day, I mean, throughout their term, but it intensifies even more in the second year. So there's just nothing going on but campaigning in all of national politics in year 2 of the president's first term. Yeah.
Just come back, you mentioned before that the president can give out executive orders to circumvent minorities in houses. How does it differ from normal legislation?
Well, the way the system, I guess, is supposed to work is that the legislature, which is the parliament, is supposed to propose and pass legislation if there's consensus behind it, and then the president signs it and it becomes the law of the land. But that presupposes that there is a will to compromise between reasonably minded elected representatives and senators. But that kind of national consensus hasn't really existed in US politics, I'd say, since the 1950s. So there's just so much polarization today that the Congress is not even able to pass the budget. They're not able to finance the government. So we're seeing numerous instances of this in recent years, where the government actually shuts down because they're not even able to pass, the financing of the entire US government. So Congress today is just too divided, too polarized. So nothing really happens legislatively, which means that presidents again have to rely on these executive orders, which are instructions that they issue to the huge national bureaucracy, and in that way tries to change public policy.
So in a sense, the president is trying to be the only grown-up in the room, since all the politicians in Congress are just playing around. Yeah. But it has to, ultimately, it relies on the president to to make the executive orders and the decisions. But money still comes from Congress, and when they fails to pass a funding bill, that's why it stops down. The system is basically dysfunctional at this point, sadly, but it is dysfunctional.
So the things that Biden will be able to do, well, he did pass a stimulus bill in March 2020, in the midst of the Delta wave surge. And he passed infrastructure reform in the fall, but that was mostly all with Democratic votes in Congress, because he has the narrowest of majorities in Congress. But he was able to get like 2 or 3 centrist, relatively centrist Republicans too on the infrastructure bill. But generally, all Democrats vote with the president, all Republicans vote against a Democratic president. So now that Biden is going to lose his narrowest of majorities in Congress, just nothing's going to get done. But again, yeah, maybe we should. That's more like the politics of it. Yeah.
Just mentioned already that Biden is most likely going to lose his majority. We won like a majority 2 years ago, both in the House and the presidential election. So we see a shift in the voting behavior of Americans. How do we explain the shift? Why do suddenly the Republicans get a majority?
It's not so much that they change their views or that the voters shift their voting patterns. It always boils down to which voters are mobilized. Mm-hmm. And when you don't have a president that kind of attracts and mobilizes his party's voters, in the midterms they can, as Hilmar said, they might become slightly more frustrated. They're not that kind of enthusiastic anymore. They are discouraged by the lack of policies and implementation, so they are not mobilized. And on the other hand, the Republicans want to mobilize for this midterm election. So it's not so much that they shift their allegiance or shift their votes, it's just as the small elements of mobilization that lifts one above the other, and then they alternate at the other times. That's why, as Hilmar said, we have this broad polarization or this divide in the American population. And these elements of mobilization is so crucial in this respect.
So just to kind of finish up off on that, there are 3 things that generally characterize a midterm election, and that is, number 1, low overall turnout. Number 2, backlash against the new president. And number 3, that the opposition is just going to be much more energized than the president's voters. So those things combined enables us to predict that the opposition is just going to take over in the next term, and at least in the House, because they have this very, very narrow majority there. But maybe we can say explain the whole thing with the gerrymandering, because that's a big factor.
I guess Alex will introduce that in a little while.
Yeah, but yeah,
we have I think time enough to talk a bit more about the dynamics.
Yeah, okay.
So Yeah, so you already mentioned a bit that it's much more about the popularity of the president than electing local representatives or rewarding or sanctioning them.
So the midterms, in a sense, since the elections are organized by the states, and you don't have this national pool by the president, the elections are basically local elections, because the politicians, House members and senators, they campaign locally and pick up local items, and not necessarily distracted by the national policies that are at stake. So as Hilmar said, the Afghanistan pullout as a kind of a distraction for the Democrats. But when people in general go to the polling stations, they think about, okay, as Reagan said, am I better off today than I was 2 years ago? And if you look at the economy in general, the inflation is going up and people are under pressure. And that's an element that the Republicans are running on in these local elections. So that's basically a sense that kind of gives them the extra boost in this midterm.
Yeah, I'd say this is probably going to be one of the worst midterm elections for an incumbent president, at least in recent decades, because inflation is at a record level. Inflation hasn't been this high in about 50 years in the United States. So inflation, there's a record inflation because of two things: just the whole kind of disruption caused by the pandemic and the disruption to the supply chains and economy caused by the pandemic. And then the second factor is the war in Ukraine, which just causes additional chaos in the national economy, if you will. So the disruption to the supply chains and the Ukraine war have caused a record inflation in the U.S. economy. So that is a huge issue. That's the number one issue, the inflation. People are just paying a lot more for just household items than they used to just a year back. For example, I was in the States in March, and I paid almost $5 at the most for a gallon of gas. And that is almost $2 more than you paid a few years ago. So that makes a huge difference in people's lives. Some people have, they pay maybe $200 to just fill up their car. And that makes a huge, it has a huge impact in the lives of millions and millions of voters. So the economy, the employment is record, unemployment is at a record low. So there is lots of jobs, and people are changing jobs all the time, and that's pushing wages up, which in turn leads to more inflation. So the problem is not unemployment, it's just the soaring prices, the inflation. So inflation, issue number one, matters a lot to a lot of people, huge impact in their lives. And I'd say a second issue that's just becoming more and more important is crime. There has also been a surge in crime in the recent, or in the last 2 years, in lots of cities in particular. And a third issue that's just rising on the agenda is now immigration, because we're also seeing a record number of people crossing into the United States across the southern border illegally. So now the Biden administration is just they're gonna just lift this Trump era restriction on immigration at the southern border, which is just going to cause a record levels of illegal immigration across the southern border. And that's actually becoming an issue with a lot of Democrats too. A lot of Democratic senators opposed lifting this restriction. So with the surge in migration across the southern border, all of these issues is just gonna lead to an awful midterm election for Joe Biden.
Thanks. So besides the issues that are at stake, one way that also influences the elections outcome is how actually votes are transferred into seats.
Mm-hmm.
Can you maybe explain a bit how the Senate is elected, Gunnar? And
the Senate is elected.
Yeah.
Okay, so as Hilmar said initially, we have that according to the Constitution, the election centers is staggered, means that there are only 1/3 of centers up for election every 2 years. And in this one, I think we have 34 senators who are up for election, and they are elected by popular vote in those various states. Up to roughly 1916, they were elected indirectly by the local legislatures, but then there was a constitutional amendment, and now they're elected by the population in those various states, basically.
Yeah, and just like in, like, for example, the Netherlands or Israel, there's just one electoral district at the state level. So the state borders are the electoral district borders. So each state has the same number of senators, 2 senators per state. So the state is the electoral district. So there's no, well, we're going to get into it, but there's no gerrymandering in the elections for the Senate. So all states have the same number of senators in the US Senate.
And how does it differ from like the House of Representatives?
So basically it's the same, that you have the so-called first past the post election in House districts, but then we have a different type of ball game, because now I think it's in 44 states as of this election cycle, the states have to be carved up into local districts in order to have one representative for each district. And that kind of gives like an introduction to the overall, the second topic here about gerrymandering. But again, the system is first past the post. The candidate that gets most votes will be elected. But the technicalities behind the process and the carving up of electoral districts is the big, challenge, usually every 10 years. Let me just say that Hilmar said correctly that there's no gerrymandering for the states because they are stuck as they are. But remember that when states were admitted to the union, then we had a gerrymandering process going on. The Missouri Compromise in 1820 permitted Missouri to enter the union, but also the compromise of chopping up Massachusetts into 2 states to have Maine as a separate state. And when the Dakota Territory was admitted to the Union, they divided in 2 states. So the Republicans at that time could get 4 senators rather than 2. Mm. So it has happened all the time. It's nothing new, but now it has increased intensity and highlighted in this election cycle.
So again, the House of Representatives, the number of representatives in Congress is determined by the population of the state. So that number changes. For example, Texas has representatives, and they're constantly getting more representatives in the House of Representatives because there's just a lot of people moving to Texas. So the population movements within the states are towards the south. So the southern states are getting more and more representatives in the House of Representatives because there are more and more people living in the states. So while the number of senators is fixed per state, the representation in the House of Representatives is determined by the state population, number of people living in the states. So every 10 years, per the Constitution, you do a count. It's called a census, which is a count of the state's population. And you see which states have gotten more people, which states have gotten fewer people. And then you reportion the number of seats, redistribute the number of seats amongst the states. So some states will lose seats, some will gain seats. Everyone will get to keep at least 1 seat. So it's like small minor states like Vermont and Wyoming have there are 2 senators, but they all have only 1 representative. While big states such as Texas and California have a lot of representatives. California has 53 representatives, and Texas has, I believe, 38 now, which makes them the 2 biggest states. And New York is another state with a lot of people, which means a lot of representatives, and the same with Florida. So again, that number of seats there changes, and they count the people every 10 years, and they reportion the seats. And that leads to this whole gerrymandering thing that we might, yeah.
So up to 1910 roughly, there was a general increase in the number of representatives as the population rose. But then they stopped increasing the number of representatives in 1910. And in 1920 or 30, there was no reapportionment because they couldn't agree on how to reapportion. So then by 1930, 435 representatives are fixed, but then the population increases, as Hilmar hinted to. So we have, as I said, the first element is to count the population, then to reapportion the 435 members to those 50 states. Technically, all states get one, so you reapportion 385. And in this last census, there were 7 seats that was taken from 7 states and given to 6 states which had increased the population. And Texas got 2 additional seats, and Montana increased from having 1 seat to having 2 seats. And then we have 6 states that only has 1 seat. So, and then not by the Constitution, but by Supreme Court decisions, each state since the 1960s need to have almost an equal number of population behind each seat for the House of Representatives. Even those who don't gain or lose any kind of seats need to redesign the district because people move around within the state. And this is where the creativity and the cynicism comes into the picture, because I think the United States is the only country in the world where the politicians elect the population and not the other way around. And this is exemplified in this redistricting process.
So I think the sense you just said, like the politicians are electing the populations, and otherwise kind of nicely summarizes what gerrymandering actually is.
Yes.
But why does it happen?
Again, when you reapportion or redistribute the seats, you have to carve up the states into electoral districts, and there's 1 representative and 1 seat per electoral district. So what politicians tend to do is that they kind of manipulate these, or they fool around with these electoral district borders in order to benefit their own party. They redraw the electoral district lines so as to increase the number of seats that their party gets in Congress, or to consolidate seats they already have. So when mostly state legislatures redraw these electoral districts, they do it in a way that tends to benefit themselves. And that's what we call gerrymandering. And that's this census, the state population count, happens every 10 years. And after that count, which was done in 2020, the states redraw the electoral districts. And that's what's been happening for the last 2 years, and it's happening right now. And there's a lot of politicking and fighting around how do you draw these electoral districts. Because again, parties try to draw them in a way that kind of locks in their own voters and locks the other party's voters into as few districts as possible.
There are 3 types of gerrymandering processes. When we talk about gerrymandering, it's the same as redistricting, but we emphasize the politicized nature of this carving out. One is the partisan gerrymandering, which is just what Hilmar just described. And there are 2 concepts that comes to mind. One is packing, and the other is cracking. Packing and cracking. I think it was one. Okay, so packing means to put a large number of voters for the other party in one district. So they gain their seats with a maximum number of votes, many of which will be wasted. And then they make sure that their own votes are distributed nicely across the districts so they can win their own seats with a comfortable but secure margin. The other type of gerrymandering is bipartisan gerrymandering, which means that the 2 parties have come to an agreement that we should secure the incumbent, that we make sure that the person who's already elected is safely re-elected. And that's a kind of agreement that the 2 parties have in order to make sure that, okay, we want to secure our own elections. And the final one is is racial gerrymandering, where you have to make sure, and of course, given the history of the United States, that minorities who have specific views and have specific interests are also taken care of. Not that they are, as minorities, are put in a specific district, but given that they vote so coherently for certain parties, that party has been made sure to win a certain district. So we have partisan gerrymandering, bipartisan gerrymandering, and racial gerrymandering, and those have a different interest, and they take place under different justifications or explanations, but it all boils down to securing your own interest or making sure that you win the race you're supposed to win. Both Republicans and Democrats have done this for decades. They have been able to do that more elegantly depending on the majorities in the various states. The Democrats did it elegantly when they were in broad power, and the Republicans have understood the game, the regional games a bit better than the Democrats. They have understood that, okay, first we have to win the national legislatures. So we can have a majority in the national legislature to elect the people or control the process of gerrymandering. And secondly, they know that, okay, if we develop the correct algorithms, computers can do the rest, because we know down to the various precincts, the various blocks and areas of where people live, roughly what kind of people live there, what their backgrounds are, and what their propensities to vote is. And given all this information into computers, we can have the computers do the rest. And then they will just make a suggestion for these districts in order to maximize their chances of winning themselves. So that's okay.
Yeah, no, just to add to that, the term gerrymandering comes from, or its name comes from the Massachusetts governor Elbridge Gerry, who in 1812 his administration was able to pass a law which ended up creating one electoral district that had the physical shape of a salamander. So they just, as a kind of a play with words, they just rename or call that district a gerrymander because it was shaped like a salamander, but because it all was traced back to this governor, they just, as a play with words, they called it a gerrymander. And the term just immediately kind of became popular and became like the official term for manipulating electoral district borders. And just as an example, in 2018, North Carolina has 13 seats in the House of Representatives, 13 seats. And in the 2018 election for the House of Representatives in North Carolina, Democrats got about as many votes as Republicans. But because of these heavily gerrymandered districts, because Republicans have a majority in the state legislature in North Carolina, because of these heavily gerrymandered districts, of those 13 seats in the House of Representatives, 10 are held by Republicans. So only 3 seats held by Democrats, even though both parties got about the same number of votes in the election. So with that kind of extreme gerrymandering, you can really like tilt the balance, if you will, balance of politics in that state. So that now there's just this really disproportionate number of Republicans elected to the House of Representatives in Washington, D.C. relative to Democrats.
Thanks. I think that is also very kind of big consequence of how US citizens perceive democracy. Can you maybe elaborate on that? Or?
Well, this is so institutionalized now that I think it's, as a political issue, I think it's just, as we say, baked into the cake. People just expect it, and it's just part of the game. And it's as old as the republics itself almost. And as you said, Democrats do this too. They do it in Oregon, to do it in Illinois, to do it in New York. So I don't know that people really kind of react to it that much because they just expect it to happen. And remember that the Senate, which is not, or there's no gerrymandering in elections for the Senate. Well, we explained that. But the Senate is just as polarized politically. The Senate is just as polarized politically, ideologically as the House of Representatives, even though there is no gerrymandering for the Senate. So I think by now it's just something that people have come to expect. But it does have systemic consequences by all means. You talked about the wasted vote effect, and another effect is that it leads to, I think you basically explained it too, the incumbent advantage, because incumbents redraw or the incumbents party redraw districts, electoral districts, so as to kind of consolidate the incumbents' advantage. A third effect of this is that, well, we alluded to it basically already, is that it can lead to over-representation of some voters and under-representation of other voters, as for example in North Carolina, as I just said. And the final effect is that it can lead to more extremism, because when one party totally controls a electoral district, the general election is not really the real election. The election in a 95% Republican electoral district, the real election there is the primary, in which the party selects candidates for the general election. And that leads candidates to kind of try to out-Trump each other in Republican districts. Who can be the most Trumpy? You see this extremely clearly now in the Senate election in Ohio. So it just leads to more, it can lead to more political, ideological extremism when the real contest in the state or in that electoral district is at the primary stage between members of the same party who's trying to appeal to the same electorate.
Yeah, so the meaningful election in US democracies now are usually the primaries and not the regular elections in November. And that's a given, that people know this. And also, as you said, Hilmar, those who participate in the primaries are just a very small minority of those parties. And those are usually the most extreme voters who are mobilized to participate. So a candidate needs to visit these extreme voters in order to be nominated for the party's candidacy. The meaningful election brings the person back to the general election, and given that this person will win in this district, then we have an effect of this polarization and extreme candidates.
But we do have still have this thing called swing districts, meaning electoral districts where actually there is almost more or less the same number of Democrats and Republicans, and the general election in November is actually relatively open. But that number is just,
yes, there's fewer of those open elections. Yes.
So in a bunch of districts now, they're just going to be like 90% of Republican, 90% of the voters are Republicans, or 90% of the voters, or even higher, are going to be Democrats. So logically, then the real competition is going to be at the primary stage. Who can appeal the most to these 10-20% of primary voters who actually show up? It might be as low as 15% of the electorate that actually shows up for the primary.
Thanks. And if we can move on to the last question, because of its negative consequences, can we do something about gerrymandering, or what has been done? Or
well, there's an extremely easy solution to gerrymandering. It can be resolved in one day. That's just to introduce proportional representation. I mean, then you can resolve the whole issue. And there's nothing in the Constitution that says that representatives are supposed to be elected by first past the post system. But over the years, the parties have vested their interest, and the Supreme Court has added to the understanding that we should have first past the post system. But the solution to all of this is evident, it's there, it's available. And interestingly, when the United States imposed an electoral system in Iraq after the occupation, what should they introduce? Should they have the first past the post system as the best in the world in the United States? No, they introduced a proportional representation system, the same as you have in Israel, as in the Netherlands. The whole country is one district. So if that was so super, you could have that themselves in the United States. There's a solution, but
It's entirely unrealistic.
it's going to happen.
Just because, well, it's just path dependency thing, where they just, they've been doing this way for 240 years now, plus, or 233 to be precise. And there's all these incentives baked into the system in order to, or that will effectively just guarantee that it goes on like this.
A more realistic solution would be to have independent commissions in each state that could draw the districts outside of the interest of elected politicians in the state assemblies. And then that's a second, not guarantee, but option, to have those suggestions decided if there's an appeal by a court in the state. But then again, the courts in the states are also elected by politicians and by, so you're back to square one.
Yeah, and they have tried. I mean, these independent, a few states have these independent, so-called independent commission, but they appoint partisan members to this commission. And one country that actually has been able to make this work is Canada. Canada used to have a problem with redistricting, but they've been able to create functional independent commissions that taken the whole issue out of the hands of partisans or parties. So in Canada, they've been able to do it, but just not going to happen in the States.
Okay, thank you very much. I think it's now time to open the floor for questions from people from Zoom here physically. So if you have a question, you can move forward and come here to the microphone and ask the panelists. Or if people are on Zoom, you can type it in the chat. So if there's no question, I can have another question. So do Americans actually want to stop the practice of gerrymandering, or is it such institutionalized that they don't care anymore?
I don't think it's really something that people think a lot about. It's kind of like an inside baseball thing, as the expression goes. It's something that, like, the politicos in Washington, D.C. and people like me and Gunnar doing rank punditry, something that we care about in academics. It's just not an issue that people talk a lot about, to be frank. Yeah, no, it's just American politics is just, or the political system is just kind of dysfunctional in so many ways, and this is just one of them. And there's just all of these other issues that should be dealt with as well, but it's just not going to happen because, as I said, they're not even able to pass a budget or to fund the government. So I'll just say a few more words about the midterms this year. So I expect that Republicans will pick up somewhere between 30 and 50 seats in House of Representatives, Republicans, so that they'll have a comfortable majority in House of Representatives in the next term. The only reason that it might not be that high, or maybe it could be even in 20s, 20 new seats, is that the Republicans overperformed in the 2020 elections for the House. Republicans did better than expected in the 2020 election for the House of Representatives, meaning that there are relatively fewer new seats to pick up, but still it could be as high as 50 new seats for the Republicans. And they will have a majority, and then they'll probably impeach Joe Biden. That's my expectation.
One of the indications of the upcoming midterm election is the number of politicians and members of Congress running away from Congress. Because the politicians, they decide to retire when it is convenient to retire. And they don't say that I'm going to retire politics this election cycle because I'm going to lose. They say, I'm going to prioritize something else. I want to spend some more time with my family. I have other interests. And the proportion of, not proportion, but the proportion between Republicans and Democrats who are retiring, I think it's roughly 30 plus Democrats who are retiring and roughly 20 Republicans retiring from the House. And that gives an indication of politicians who are extremely well aware of the chances of winning and the party's chances of winning / losing. So they withdraw in time, not to lose face. So that's an indication that kind of supports your estimate that there will be a big change in the House of Representatives. The only midterm year that comes to mind where there was not a loss for the incumbent president, I think was 1998, when Clinton, in his 6th year and in his second midterm election, actually the Democrats gained seats in Congress. And that was partly because the economy was running like a well-oiled machine. Everything was going extremely well. And the Republicans had not handled the impeachment process or the upcoming disrespect impeachment for President Clinton very well, and kind of stumbled toward the midterm elections. But other than that, I mean, as you said, it's going to be a disaster for the Democrats, but we don't know how much it's going to be.
So in 17 out of 19 post-war midterm elections, the president's party has lost seats. So in 17 of 19 midterm elections post-war, president's parties lost seats. And in some midterms, they lose an exceptional amount of seats, which would be 1994, 2006, and 2010. Those elections we called wave elections. Wave elections are elections in which the presidents lose around 50 seats. And I think this could be another wave election. The only reason that it might not be is because Republicans, as I said, did surprisingly well in 2020. Yeah.
No, does it work? Oh, no. Well, how does gerrymandering and the elections in general, how do they relate to the theory, or rather the fear expressed in the Constitution of the tyranny of the majority, and also the fact that the word democracy, as we know it in Europe, isn't mentioned in the Constitution. So in that case, how does it really relate to their understanding of democracy and gerrymandering and the general election in general? So yeah, that's my question.
Thank you.
You can just, it's a big question. I might have to think for.
So in terms of the concept that you refer to, the tyranny of the masses, I think that's kind of taken care of by the system itself.
Yeah.
Because you have different elections and you have different time for elections and you have different constituencies in the US system. So the absence of the tyranny of the masses has been taken care of by the system, by the fact that you have staggered elections in the Senate, the fact that you have elections every other year for the House and for every 4th year for the president. That kind of spreads the risk out. Of course, you have a chance when you have a divided, you have a unified government, like you have, and the big, example of this is the Roosevelt administration, Democrats in the 1930s. They could just ram through whatever policies they had without any obstruction. But that's an exception. I think the structure itself takes care of the tyranny of the masses, unless the Republicans will be the tyranny of the masses.
Yeah, so the system has lots of these so-called counter-majoritarian institutions that, as well as you say, are intended to prevent the tyranny of the majority, if you will. So the redistricting process, gerrymandering process, that's like one element of that. And then, as you said, you have the Senate with the staggered elections. You have the Electoral College. And the Senate wasn't even popularly elected for the first 140 years or so. And also federalism itself. So all these mechanisms for sharing powers between these various institutions and actors. So one of the reasons that in 2017, the Supreme Court ruled that they're not going to get involved with or get into, they don't want to touch partisan gerrymandering, because they said the framers, the drafters of the Constitution, anticipated the process of gerrymandering. They anticipated that politicians would try to manipulate this process, and they still left it to the state legislators to do it. So, well, that's how these majority of Supreme Court argued. So, this kind of whole mentality that, you know, you have to kind of prevent the tyranny of the masses, if you will. You have to have all these majoritarian institutions in place. That goes back to the founding in all sorts of ways. And one of them is just, well, that Supreme Court ruling in 2019 showed that, or you could argue that even gerrymandering goes, or the framers knew it would happen and they were okay with it.
So kind of like a functional, dysfunctional system.
Yeah, well, it's a system that doesn't really. It's a system that's has this fear of majority rule again. As we said, it's a system that's always been very okay with having all these checkpoints within the system, but that's a system that was designed in 1780s. When the political norms were a little bit different from what they are today. So today we see a lot of pressure to reform the United States or the political system. Some people want to abolish an electoral college. I guess that's like the main issue they have, and even the whole structure of the Senate. So this system was put in place 240 years ago when the political norms were quite different. And today you could say that there's just kind of, or it's become, what's the term I'm looking for? Stale, or anyway, the system is kind of not working in a way that's satisfactory, I would say, to the majority of the population. But the Republicans and conservatives generally, they've been able to control a lot of these counter-majoritarian institutions, so they don't want to change the system. But I think that American politics is increasingly becoming a conflict about, you know, the nature of the system itself. But these institutions, it's really hard to change how they work, and that causes a lot of the polarization today.
The structure for changing the Constitution is so demanding and contains so many veto points that one is unable to change the Constitution per se. Referring to what you said, Hilmar, about the electoral college, that's so embedded in the Constitution, you cannot change it. But since the elections take place at the state level, and the states decide who wins or not wins, there's something called the National Popular Vote Plan, in which the states can coordinate among themselves to whom they want to allocate the electors. And in that sense, the plan is just that you can bypass the electoral college and then come up with a winner of the presidential election who also has a majority of voters behind him or eventually her. But that again, it kind of invites that much creativity and coordination, which is difficult in terms of, you know, getting it happen, but it's possible.
We have a question from the audience. Please come forward.
So given all these developments, do we see a rise of strategic voting on individual level, or are like the typical or classic models that we have for predicting voter behavior still suitable and in place? Do they still predict how certain people are they more likely to vote for Democrats or Republicans, or tend people to know about, or well, they're aware of gerrymandering and all of these processes, and do they take this into consideration when they make up their minds for their vote?
Voters may think strategically, but the point from individual voters thinking strategically to coordinated collective action is such a large span of resources and coordination. I don't think it's going to happen. So, and again, were it to happen at the very local area, and of course it could happen in very local elections to the local dog catcher, but in terms of the members of Congress or even the presidential election, I don't think it will happen. So we're back to the basic models of who votes for certain reasons and why they do that.
Yeah, with the level of gerrymandering that exists today, there's just not going to be possible to kind of strategize, as you say, strategize so as to make the other candidate win. I mean, if the district is 90% Republican or 90% Democratic, it's just not going to be feasible. But one possibly interesting case is Liz Cheney in Wyoming now, because she is fallen out of favor with the Trumpists. So she's being primaried in her reelection this year in Wyoming. Wyoming only has one representative. So there's at least some chatter about whether or not Democrats could actually try to vote in the Republican primary to help reelect Republican Liz Cheney, so that there's not this other super mega Trumpy candidate that wins Republicans primary instead, because normally Liz Cheney would not have anything to worry about in heavily Republican Wyoming, but she voted for the impeachment of Trump second time. So she is, that's total heresy in Republican politics. That's unforgivable. So she's fallen out of favor with pretty big time. So we'll see if there's enough strategic voting. I doubt it. I think she's in trouble, but it's an interesting case.
Okay, thank you. We're running over time, so I think we're finishing now. I want to thank you all here in the audience, also on Zoom for attendance. Also want to thank Hilmar and Gunnar for their excellent comments today. And also, of course, I also want to thank Sander for making this event possible. So thank you all.